And chapter 13, spinal cord, we're going to look at the spinal nerves. Before we get to the spinal nerves, we're going to go over what does the spinal cord look like, what are the structures of the spinal cord, and all that good stuff. Spinal cord is the highway. It sends signals from the brain to the tissue and the muscles and glands. It also sends information the opposite way up to the brain. So what's happening? It has to conduct that signal. It has to integrate between the different parts of the nervous system. It has to produce motion so that coordinated contractions of several muscle groups in the limbs. You probably kind of forgot about all this where you're like, if you're going to use a muscle group, you want to be able to use the one that you want to, the main one, and you want to use the ones that are not being used so you have balance in that joint. And then reflexes is going to be in part 2. So the spinal cord, it's a cylinder of nervous tissue from the brainstem at the foramen magnum of the skull, passes through the vertebral canal, and ends at L1. Why does it end at L1? So your spinal cord ends just below your ribs. You're like, that's all the way up here. So your spinal cord ends just below your ribs because your ribs end at T12 at L1. Because when your spinal cord was growing, you were roughly 5, 6, 7, maybe 10, depending on, there's many confusion and controversy of when it actually stops. But right around, let's just say 10. How tall were you? You were not as tall as you are right now, or 6. What happens is that you keep growing. Your spinal cord doesn't grow anymore because it's very difficult for the neurons to grow. So what happens is the axons just grow longer. So the spinal cord keeps going up. The axons get longer, so they keep reaching the muscles of your legs, your abdominal pelvic cavity, and your feet. So your spinal cord ends at L1. It occupies the upper 2/3 of the vertebral canal, obviously because it ends at L1. And you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Memorize 31 pairs. The reason why there's 31 is a little complicated. So we're going to look at cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccyx again. And each segment is a part of the spinal cord supplied by each pair of spinal nerves, and I'll kind of show you that picture to kind of show you what it means. So on the spinal cord, you have a couple of things you can see. Anterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus. If you're in the lab, you're looking at the model, take your finger and your fingernail and kind of poke the front of it. You're going to see on the front of it, it's going to have a pretty deep indentation. That's going to be the anterior median fissure. The one on the back is going to be a lot smaller. That's the posterior median sulcus. You can have cervical and lumbar enlargements. We're not going to get into that in this lecture. We are going to look at the conus medullaris and the cauda equina. The conus medullaris is where it starts to taper right around L1. And the cauda equina is that bundle of axons. If you kind of look at cauda equina and you're like, that looks familiar, cauda means tail, equina means horse, so it's a ponytail, and you know, if you translate it. So what happens is if you remove the spinal cord, you have this medullary cone that's a cone shape. All those little fibers coming off of it look like little hairs of a ponytail. So where does the spinal cord end? L1. Don't get that wrong. And here's just another view. You can see that the spinal cord, that's T12, it ends right around L1 with the cone, with the medullary cone, and then you have the cauda equina going all the way down. And here you can see how each bundle of nerve coming out of the spinal cord will go through one of those holes that will create a spinal nerve. You have a couple of different things on the brain and the spinal cord. First off, meninges. From superficial to deep, dura mater, arachnoid matter, pia mater. If you speak German, you're looking at dura mater and you're like, does that just say tough mother? And it does. Dura is tough, from durable. Mater is mother or maternal. So tough mother. In your lab class, if you're in person and you get a brain that still has the meninges on it, when you have your gloves on, try to tear the dura mater. Then get scissors and try to cut the dura mater. Then when that fails, try to use a scalpel and try to cut it. And then finally just get one of those little sharp probes and just start poking it. Because if you kind of understand and can see and feel how tough the dura mater is, then you understand that's the real protection between the bone to the spinal cord and the brain. The arachnoid matter is attached to the dura mater, and if you slowly kind of remove the arachnoid matter, you can see that it kind of has these little hairs, and these hairs kind of look like spider webs. So it's kind of interesting to see. I can explain it to you, but if you see it in lab, you actually can understand it. And then pia mater is going to be on top of the brain or the spinal cord. So if you're in lab, you look at the brain and you have no meninges because another class already used them and destroyed them, you can just take your little sharp probe and just kind of lift the top of the gyri and the sulci of the brain, and that little membrane that you bring up is the pia mater. It's always going to be connected to the spinal cord and the brain, even after you remove everything else. And cerebral spinal fluid, which we'll talk about in the brain, is going to be in the space between the arachnoid and the pia mater. And then there you go, dura mater up here, arachnoid mater there. Those are those little fibers that keep it connected. And when you remove it, they kind of look like little spider webs. And then the pia mater down there, and the subarachnoid space is where you have your cerebral spinal fluid. And this is kind of disturbing, but this is spinal bifida. So spinal bifida is when the vertebral columns just don't completely form. And because embryonically, nerve fibers are just going to grow unchecked. They're not going to be stopped. They're going to continue to grow and grow and grow and grow. And the only thing that keeps them in their little area is those vertebral arches. So if you do not have the right nutrients during fetal development, the spinal cord will start to grow outside the body, and that's called spinal bifida. Usually one in about 1,000 babies have it. This is why if you are thinking about getting pregnant or you are pregnant, every doctor on pretty much the face of the earth will say take prenatal vitamins. They tell you to take prenatal vitamins. One of the main ones is because of folic acid. Folic acid is a B vitamin, and if you have folic acid, it lowers the risk of spinal bifida. And because you need to have this before you get pregnant, some people will say to take this during the first 3 months or 3 months before you get pregnant, because this defect occurs within the first 4 weeks of development, and it'll kind of make a little more sense when we talk about embryonic development of the brain and spinal cord. So if you have folic acid in the beginning of your pregnancy, you're less likely to have a baby with spinal bifida. So you have white and gray matter. Gray matter just has nuclei, so they have cell bodies. White matter has myelin. So you've already learned at this point, myelin is for transmitting messages. If you transmit the message, point A to point B, up and down, that gives us these columns on the back, in the sides, and the front, and it gives us the horns in the back, the sides, and the front. You can have posterior or dorsal horns. You can have posterior dorsal roots. You can have anterior ventral horns, anterior roots, great commissure, lateral horns, pretty much. In the spinal cord, the different parts of the spinal cord are going to have different types of tracts because they go to different things. For the most part, generally speaking, you're going to have white columns on the back, sides, and the front, and you're going to have dark little butterfly wings called horns. That's a posterior or dorsal horn, lateral, ventral horn. Dorsal column, lateral column, ventral column. So I just want you to look at where are the horns and where are the columns. And finally, we didn't get to it yet, but we will. That's the dorsal root ganglia, and that's how you tell what is the back of the spinal cord. If you've done this in lab before, or yet, you're going to look at the dorsal root ganglia first. That's how you tell what's the back, and that's how you tell what's the front. So that just goes over more of the same information. There are ascending and descending tracts. Ascending tracts carry sensory information. Descending tracts carry motor information. If I didn't even tell you that, just from the last lecture, you should learn afferent, part of the nervous system, is carrying signals into the brain. How do they do that? By ascending tracts of the spinal cord. The efferent, or motor, or exiting, is exiting the brain and going down in descending tracts of the spinal cord. You can have things that decusate. That just means when they pass up or down the brainstem, they cross over to the left or the right, or vice versa. They can be contralateral, when the origin and destination are on the same side, or ipsilateral, when they're on the when the origin and the destination of the tract are on the same side of the body. So contralateral, opposite, ipsilateral, same side. I think I mixed that up when I said contralateral. So ascending tracts, sensory. Descending tracts, descending to motor. And then where they go to the lower motor neuron, in the brainstem or the spinal cord, axon of lower motor neuron leads the rest of the way to the muscle or target organ. Those synapses are in the anterior horn. So you have that motor signal going all the way down the spinal cord. Once it reaches its level that it's going to go in the anterior horn, that's where it synapses to the axon that carries it the rest of the way. And the spinal cord communicates with the rest of the body by spinal nerves. Some of the nerves are going to be sensory, some of them are going to be motor. A couple of them are going to be mixed because they carry both sensory and motor. We talked about the Schwann cell in the peripheral nervous system. If you see a Schwann cell in the peripheral nervous system, you know that axon is going to be myelinated. Polio and ALS. Both diseases are destruction of the motor neurons, and then this causes the muscle fibers to atrophy, because if they don't get innervations, they don't think they're needed, so they die back. Poliomyelitis is the myelination from polio. It's caused by the polio virus. It destroys the motor neurons in brainstem and anterior horn of the spinal cord. If you remember anterior horn of the spinal cord, what's happening in the anterior horn of the spinal cord? That's where that last signal takes it to the muscle. So if you have damage to the motor neurons in the brainstem, going down to the anterior horn of the spinal cord, you don't have a signal telling that muscle to contract. If that muscle does not contract, muscle pain, weakness, loss of some reflexes, then it's going to be paralysis. The muscle dies through atrophy, and then if it just happens to be a muscle of the diaphragm or the respiratory muscles, you can start going through respiratory arrest because you can't breathe on your own. And what happens with polio, this virus gets spread through fecal matter and contaminated water. So ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. This is kind of very similar. It leads to destruction of the motor neurons and muscular atrophy, but this is caused by scarring. Kind of remember back, there's other things that replace the myelin with scarring. This is the same thing, but this is happening when astrocytes fail to reabsorb the neurotransmitter glutamate from the tissue fluid. The glutamate will then start to accumulate, become toxic, causes muscular weakness, difficulty speaking, swallowing, loose of hands. Because this is motor, everything in the brain, so your personality, your ability to talk, your ability to think, all of that remains unaffected. But it's the muscles on the peripheral nervous system that's being damaged in ALS. So just another look, sensory, afferent, bringing it to the central nervous system. Motor, efferent, carrying it away from the central nervous system. I mentioned some of them are mixed. I talked about the ganglia and the dorsal root ganglia. That's a larger view of it where you can see all the neurosomas or the cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglia. And that's how you can tell if it's the back of the spinal cord or if it's the front. And on this you can see the dorsal root ganglia is sensory, motor pathway is moving the other way at this level. How many pairs? 31 pairs, I mentioned it before. It's kind of strange because you have 7 cervical vertebrae, you have 12 thoracic vertebrae, you have 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. So right when you have that first one that comes out before C1, the vertebrae 1, then after cervical vertebrae 1, you have cervical nerve 2. So totally you have 8. You just have 12 thoracic spinal nerves, just like you have 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 1 coccygeal, which gives you a pair of 31. Spinal nerves, they're proximal branches of the spinal nerves. But the way to kind of look at this is you can have dorsal root is sensory, ventral is going to be motor input out of the spinal cord. You have the cauda equina, which we talked about. That's the medullary cone and the cauda equina. This is kind of the way they kind of come out and look. But with this picture, it's much easier to see. So even though you remove the vertebrae, and you can see there are little axons coming out, bundles of axons actually. And what they do is all of them come together and go out one hole in the vertebrae. And that's how you get a spinal root or a spinal nerve, where it's a bunch of them. So in muscles, if you have a chiropractor for your lab teacher, they probably told you C3, 4, 5 keeps you alive, and that's the diaphragm. The spinal roots for the diaphragm is cervical 3, 4, and 5. So all of those fibers will eventually make their way down to the diaphragm. Another way to look at it, if you had a back injury, you go in, let's just say somebody hates you and they hit you in the back with a baseball bat. If they hit you in, let's just say, T5, are they going to damage your spinal cord? Yeah. Yep, because you still have spinal cord there. If they hit you in L4, are they damaging your spinal cord? Nope, because your spinal cord ends at L1.